need you to listen to me. Alright? You're under arrest for the following offences. You're under arrest on suspicion of murder, conspiracy to murder, manslaughter, conspiracy to rob, and conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something which you later align in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence.
On Saturday, March the 9th, 2024, among the passengers on board a flight from Amsterdam to Manchester sat a very different kind of traveller. Not the one who's blary-eyed and hungover after days of revelling in the Dutch capital. It was John Belfield, and he wasn't coming back from a weekend away. He wasn't nursing a hangover. This was a man who had eluded capture for nearly 18 months after orchestrating one of the most brutal murders Greater Manchester had ever seen, and he was finally on his way home to justice. His return marked the conclusion of a sprawling international manhunt and the beginning of a new chapter in the fight to secure justice for Thomas Campbell, a father of two tortured and murdered in his own home. For Belfield, it was the end of the road for detectives. It was the breakthrough moment that they had been relentlessly working for, and for Thomas Campbell's grieving family, a step closer to closure. So until that flight, John Belfield had remained one step ahead of the law. He slipped out of the UK just days after the killing. He travelled to Ireland via ferry using a false identity. From there, his journey would then span continents, from Ireland to the Netherlands, then to Spain, then on to Brazil, and then finally to the little-known Dutch colony of Suriname. It's on the northeastern coast of South America. It was a remarkable escape involving trains, planes and boats. Far removed from his origins in Gorton, Manchester, where he once lived as a mid-level drug dealer. But Belfield's time on the run eventually caught up with him, and the story of his flight and the gruesome crime that sparked it reads like a plot of a thriller. So on Sunday, July the 2nd, 2022, a neighbour noticed that Thomas Campbell's front door in Mossley, Tameside had been left ajar. Concerned, they contacted authorities, and what officers found inside the three-storey new-built home was beyond comprehension. Thomas Campbell was found dead in his hallway, naked except for a pair of socks. His body bore the hallmarks of a prolonged and savage attack. A total of 61 separate injuries, including stab wounds, slash wounds to his face, bruises and burns. He had been bound by the wrists and ankles with duct tape, tortured for hours, and subjected to boiling liquid being poured over his genitals. The sheer brutality of the killing had stunned police. The house had been turned over, his walls splattered with blood. The hard drive of the home's internal CCTV system had been removed. Proof investigators said that whoever committed the crime knew what they were doing. No DNA was recovered, yet within hours suspicion turned towards one man, John Belfield. Though he had managed to stay off the police radar throughout a decade of drug dealing, intelligence report linked both Campbell and Belfield to cannabis and cocaine trafficking. But this wasn't just a turf war. It was deeply personal, because at the heart of the feud, there was a twisted love triangle. Thomas Campbell had entered into a relationship with a woman who goes by the name of Demi Lee, who had previously dated Belfield. Jealous and possessive, Belfield saw her not as a person, but as property. In vile messages, he said, "You will never have a boyfriend, you will have to move country, give it a week, and you will see what happens when you take the piss with me. I'm a bad man." Fueled by bitterness and a bruised ego, Belfield reached out to Colleen Campbell, who was Thomas's ex-wife and the mother of his children. Their marriage had ended in divorce in 2019, and Colleen was still nursing her own resentment. The two began to plot revenge. Their toxic alliance formed through messages and Instagram DMs. Colleen, who ran an aesthetics business in Clayton, passed sensitive information to Belfield about Thomas's habits, routines and whereabouts. To execute his plan, Belfield recruited true, trusted criminal associates. Stephen Cleworth, who was a violent offender, he placed a tracking device on Thomas's car, and Reese Stephen, who was linked to Cleworth, was one of the attackers who would later storm Campbell's home. Surveillance was carried out, plans were made, and the first attempt to ambush Campbell on June the 30th failed when he unexpectedly left the house to walk his dog. The attackers regrouped, and on July the 2nd, shortly after 11 p.m, they struck. Thomas Campbell stood no chance. As he opened the door, he was rushed by three men. He fought back, but he was overpowered. His front door was shut behind him. He would never see his home alive again. Detectives began A meticulous investigation scouring mobile phone records, CCTV footage, and tracking device data. It wasn't long before the web began to unravel. One of the most damning discoveries was the communication between Belfield and Colleen Campbell. Within 10 days of the murder, Colleen, initially viewed as a grieving ex-wife, was arrested and later charged. The evidence against the group mounted. In 2023, Belfield's accomplices were brought to trial. Reece Stephen was convicted of murder. Colleen Campbell and Stephen Cleworth were found guilty of manslaughter and conspiracy to rob, but the mastermind was still out there. Using a false passport, Belfield fled to Dublin, then travelled through Europe before getting into Brazil, and from there he crossed into Suriname, where he thought he'd be safe. And then for months he lived under the radar. Then in March 2023, he was arrested in Paramaribo, the capital of Suriname, because he was dealing drugs there. Authorities in the country, upon discovering his true identity, alerted Greater Manchester Police, but extraditing a murder suspect from Suriname, a country with limited formal legal ties to the UK, was complicated. Greater Manchester Police worked with international partners and Surinamese officials for nearly a year, and during that time, Belfield was imprisoned in harsh conditions. He referred to his jail time there as it was horrendous, to be honest. Finally, in March 2024, the UK was informed that Belfield would be deported after serving a sentence in Suriname. Owing to the country's colonial past, the deportation route passed through Amsterdam, and from there, accompanied by a British office, Belfield was flown to Manchester. Waiting on the tarmac at Manchester Airport was Detective Sergeant Paul Davis, the lead officer on the case, and he carried out the burden of his investigation for more than a year and had borne witness to the grief of Thomas Campbell's family. He said it was frustrating. You've got a grieving family asking where he is, and I don't have the answers. And then when he got the news to say that Belfield was being expelled from Suriname, he goes, there's the initial brilliant, we've got him. And then the logistical questions begin. How do we get him back? So on the 2nd of July 2025, exactly 3 years after Thomas Campbell's brutal murder, John Belfield was found guilty of his role in the killing. At Manchester Crown Court, a jury convicted him of murder and conspiracy to rob, and for the detectives who pursued him across the globe, it marked the end of a relentless journey, and for Campbell's family offered long-awaited sentence of justice. So the sentencing judge had the following to say, and this is how long he got. So these are the judge's sentencing remarks. He goes, yesterday afternoon, the jury found you guilty of conspiracy to rob and the murder of Thomas Campbell. Now it falls to me to sentence you. In doing so, I only make finding of fact against you when I am sure of those findings. My conclusions will be consistent with the verdicts of the jury. Mr. Campbell was no saint. Like you, he was involved in the sale and the distribution of illicit drugs, but he was also a human being. And the manner of his death was horrific. His friends and family have had to sit through the description of the injuries you inflicted on him and the suffering he was forced to endure. That can only have been a dreadful experience for them. Mr. Campbell's father has provided a victim personal statement, which was read to the court, and he describes the profound grief that the killing of his son has had on their family. It is plain that he was greatly loved by his family. It has affected all of the family and has now left Thomas Campbell's 2 children without a father, others without a brother and a son. You, John Belfield, played what I conclude was a leading role in the conspiracy to rob and in the attack that led ultimately to Mr. Campbell's death. The conspiracy consisted of an agreement for a gang of thugs, of which you were the leader of the pack, to attack Mr. Campbell's home and steal from him drugs, which you believed he kept there, along with other valuables. Just as you had been at the centre of the conspiracy to rob Mr. Campbell, so you were at the heart of the group who murdered him. No one outside that group can know exactly what happened inside the address on the night of the 2nd and the 3rd of July 2022, or precisely who delivered which blows with knives, boots or fists, nor is it known precisely who decided to humiliate Mr. Campbell by stripping him naked, nor who it was who decided to inflict yet further pain and suffering on Mr. Campbell by tipping boiling water over his naked buttocks, but you, I have no doubt, were the leader of that gang. The injuries that you and the group inflicted were described in detail by the pathologist. They were horrendous. In the end, death was caused by multiple knife injuries, blunt force head injuries, and asphyxiation pressure to the neck. But in my judgment, the prosecution's description of what happened over a period of almost 2 hours after the group of you ambushed Mr. Campbell on the doorstep of his home was accurate. Mr. Campbell was tortured and was tortured to the point of death. I find as a fact that this grotesque mistreatment began as a means of extracting information from Mr. Campbell about the whereabouts of his drugs. It was a murder in the context of a robbery, but I also find as a fact that you took pleasure in the infliction of pain on him. Mr. Campbell was a rival of yours in the grimy world of illicit drugs, and you regarded it as acceptable to steal his cash and drugs from him, if necessary by use of violence. But at least as significant, he was your rival for the affections of a woman who goes by the name of Demi. I reject it is entirely your explanation that you were happy to split up from Demi. I have no doubt that the fact that Demi was now the partner of Mr. Campbell was an important part of your motivation for what you did on the 2nd of July. You suggested evidence that you were being sarcastic when you described yourself by means of emojis as heartbroken after she took up with Thomas Campbell. I conclude that exactly what you felt. You were jealous. You wanted Thomas Campbell to suffer. That is why you and your gang attacked him as he opened his front door and bulldozed him into the house. You wanted to ensure he was utterly at your mercy. That is why you had purchased gaffer tape from B&Q 2 days earlier. You and your gang planned to use that gaffer tape to immobilize Mr. Campbell whilst you cut him about, which is precisely what you did. This is why you, or those acting at your direction, systematically cut parallel lines across his face. You wanted to disfigure him because you wanted him to believe that even if he escaped with his life, no woman would want him. And that is why you used tourniquet on his arm after he was slashed across his arm. You didn't want him to die too quickly. I have no doubt you took pleasure from his pain. Against that background, I turn to sentence you. The sentence I impose on you for murder is required as a matter of law to be imprisonment for life. I have in addition a fixed minimum term before your case can even be considered by the parole board. In my view, as a serious case as this, it does not justify a whole life term. I've considered the sentencing remarks of Mr. Justice Goose in the case of Stephen Cleworth and Colin Campbell, but after sentencing on the findings I make based on the evidence that I have heard. He goes, stand up. Was John Belfield. For the offence of murder, I impose a sentence of life imprisonment. You will serve a minimum of 34 years and 261 days before you are eligible for parole, and upon your release you will be subject to license and possible recall for the rest of your life. And then on the conspiracy to rob, I sentence you to a concurrent sentence of 16 years. Take him down.